Hi, third graders. We're getting down to the wire of this book. Today I'm going to be reading chapters 21 through 23. So I'm going to be reading 3 chapters today. All right, chapter 21. Pax watched Runt all night and into the next day from a bush not far away. He left only to soothe his burned lip in the cool river mud and make a meal of the small fish he found lying on the bank. His sense of smell returned, and whenever he woke from a fitful doze, he sniffed for Bristle and Runt to reassure himself that they were still alive. Bristle had dragged brush to the fallen tree to shelter her brother and curled her body over his to keep him warm. She left him briefly a few times, and when she did, Pax quietly took her place beside Runt's motionless form. He was there when Runt finally woke with a whimper. Pax nuzzled Runt's shoulder to comfort him. Runt lifted his head. His eyes were clouded with pain and fear. He cried out again, and Bristle, who had been hunting nearby, trotted back to him. Pax pulled back respectful, but Bristle merely settled herself alongside her brother, her cheek beside his. Pax bent to Runt's wound and licked it cautiously, wary of Bristle's reaction. She watched him carefully, but did not object. Pax set to a thorough cleaning of the wound. Runt watched him with a trusting gaze and did not flinch. When Pax finished, he cleaned Runt's ears and face, and Bristle allowed it. When Runt had fallen asleep again, Pax stayed beside the two. Together, he and Bristle watched the activity of the camp. Although the humans did not return to the ruined part of the field, the scents were dangerous. When the wind was from the west, carrying the smell of burned land, the men seemed tense. More arrived at the camp with more machines. At the sudden growl of an engine, Bristle jumped. She laid her head back over her brother's. I must move him soon. Humans cannot scent. If we are hidden from view, we are safe. Bristle looked from him to the men. We are not safe if a single human is nearby. Bristle seemed lessened to Pax, as if a vital piece of her had disappeared. He knew that somehow the humans had taken it. My boy does not bring harm. He is not like them. He is not war-sick. The war-sick are full-grown. He is still young. No, it is another difference. Pax was sure about this, but he was also confused. Over the past, Peter had grown taller and stronger, and his voice had deepened. But more than that, his scent had changed. It was no longer the scent of a child. He is not young, but he is not war-sick. The last day I saw him, he cared for me, although he himself was in pain. His eyes shed water. His eyes were wounded? Pax thought for a moment about the mystery of crying. No, when he is hurt in other places. His eyes shed water. It streams down his face. I think the pain is relieved by the flowing water. But his breath, he gulps for air as though this pain water may be drowning him. The vixen bent to lick more dried blood from her sleeping brother's haunch. After a while, she raised her gaze to Pax, and in it, Pax saw the terrible things that had been done to her family by humans. And then Pax understood something. Peter had thrown the toy into the woods the last day. The pain water had been flowing from his eyes, and he had thrown the toy, and he was not followed. My boy is not war-sick, but he has changed. He is now false acting. Chapter 22. Peter lit the 4 big lanterns hanging from the barn rafters. The tools, the sharpening wheel, the wall full of puppets, all glowed warm and cheerful in the cones of amber light. Even the hay shone like Rumpelstiltskin's gold. The barn looked reborn but familiar. He knew it like a home now. Home. As soon as he put on Vola's puppet show just another hour from now, he would finally be free to start out again. He lit the 2 small lanterns near the stage and lifted Sinbad from the wall. Showtime. The marionette's black eyes looked back at him blankly. Peter checked the joints, still amazed that Vola had taken the puppet apart just so he could learn its secrets. And suddenly Vola's secret philosophy card flashed in his mind. I would have been a good teacher. She was right about that. He thought about how easily she suggested techniques in his drills without making a big deal of anything, how she had him watch while she carved, then let him figure out things for himself, how she asked him questions about everything and didn't answer for him. But she was all wrong about being too dangerous to be near people. Anyone who knew her would tell her that. The problem was that no one knew her, except maybe him. He hung the marionette back on the wall. I think, Sinbad, I'm going to give you the night off. He went outside and fished a wrist-thick limb out of the brush pile. Back inside, he sawed off the ends and nailed on the base. He lashed the rock's tin bowl nest to the top and fixed it on the stage. Next, he lifted the sorceress puppet from its perch and unscrewed its left leg. Ready? Vola called out. Peter climbed to the stack of hay bales he'd set up behind the stage and picked up the sorceress's controls, surprised his hands weren't shaking. Because suddenly, everything he'd been so sure of an hour ago now seemed like a terrible idea. When she'd come into the barn, Vola had been wearing a long purple skirt instead of her overalls, and she had combed her hair, something Peter had never seen before. He had been astounded at the stage he'd built, and it hadn't been an act. You have the makings of a woodworker, she said. If I were in the market for an apprentice, I'd offer you the spot. In another few minutes, what would she think of him? It was too late for second guessing, though. Ready, he lied. Vola turned down the 4 overhead lanterns. Then Peter heard her drag a stool to the middle of the barn. This is the story of a girl, he said. He heard Vola take in a sharp breath, and then he didn't hear a sound after that. Now when he pulled the curtain and drew the sorceress up from the plank, not when the seed corn had piled on her stomach like peaches spilled off. Not when he wrapped her in his camouflage t-shirt, tucked her hair into a clay bowl helmet, and slid the stick into her hand as a rifle. Not when he had shot the rifle, not when he unscrewed her leg, not when he made her climb to the nest. Peter had expected a protest when he lit the nest on fire, but still Vola didn't make a sound. And just as he'd practiced, the fire was only a momentary flare as the handful of wood shavings in the bowl flashed up, just enough time for him to take off the marionette's army uniform. He drew her up out of the nest and eased her to the stage, where he'd propped the child puppet beside his carved fox. He had her bend low to the child, then turn the stroke and stroke the fox, and then he pulled the curtain. Peter hung the controls. He waited, but still there was only silence. He stretched to look over the stage. Vola stared straight ahead, right through him, her face as rigid as if it had been carved of wood. The tears streaming down her cheeks gleamed in the flickering light. Somehow they only served to make her look noble. I'm sorry, I only meant you're not a grenade. You are good. You took me in. You're training me so I can get Pax. Leave me alone, boy. Her voice was low and wire-tight. Wait, I think it's stupid to waste your life out here for some kind of punishment. I mean, maybe that guy didn't even care about that book. Maybe he won it in a poker game that night before. Maybe what he cared about was, I don't know, Peter steeled himself, being a teacher or something. At the word teacher, Vola shot her chin at him, and he didn't look away. Yeah, maybe he wanted to be a teacher. So maybe you should go do that for him. But you'll never know, so I think you should go out and live your life. I'm just saying that whatever bad thing wrecked you before, you could start over like the Phoenix, and I know what you're saying. You're not wrong, but get out of here now. Leave me be. Peter started to argue, but his words withered at the sight of her sitting so still, head so high, tears now rolling down her neck. He wrapped the sorceress's controls and then climbed down from the hay bales and picked up his crutches. The silence of the barn felt enormous. Okay, he said just to break it. The walk to the cabin in the dark took forever. Inside, a covered plate rested on the counter. He slumped against the door frame, washed in guilt. Vola had made it up for him for the dinner leftovers. You pick this chicken clean later tonight, you hear me? A wash wave of guilt. A fresh wave of guilt. She'd killed a chicken, something she didn't do often, because she wanted him to have more protein. Peter shoved off from the doorframe and scooped a box of matches from beside the stove. He had no idea how long she'd stay out there, but when she came back, it wouldn't be to a cold, dark cabin. This much he could do for her. He lit all the lamps and then laid a fire just the way he'd seen Vola do it each night. Sitting there, watching it catch and grow, he replayed everything he'd said. It had all been true. Well, the part about the soldier maybe wanting to be a teacher had probably pushed it, but who knew, maybe he had. No, there wasn't a single thing he hadn't meant to say, nothing he regretted. A gust blew down the chimney, threatening the fragile fire. He reached for another section of newspaper. As he crumpled it, a headline caught his eye. Forces prepare to engage area to be evacuated. He flattened the sheet and read. He studied the map, unbelieving. And then he grabbed his crutches and pegged out to the porch so fast that Francis scrambled from his nest and shot out into the night. He jammed his clothes into his pack, then looked around. The phoenix bracelet, the photo of his mother, and his mitt and ball were the only things of his in the room. He propped the bracelet on the hammock where Vola would find it, dropped the other things into the pack, and swung up into the kitchen. Vola was just coming in. She hung her hat on the peg and looked over to the fire, then back at him, at his pack. He handed the sheet of newspaper to her. Vola scanned it, then looked up for an explanation. He pointed to the map. The area they're closing off, he choked. That's only 5 miles from where I left Pax. Are you sure? It's a big area. I'm sure. See this empty place? It's an abandoned rope mill. It's got all these high stones and it sits overlooking the river at the only place you can cross it. The rest is gorge. That's where they'll fight for the water. My friends and I used to play war at the mill. We said it was the perfect place for an ambush. We played war. I left Pax on the road leading up to it, thinking it would be the word safe stuck in his throat. He shot up and lurched over to the pegs at the door to grab his sweatshirt. Stop. They're preparing for battle there. Don't be crazy. It's not crazy. It's right. I know it now. Remember the cheese? You asked what kind I liked and I didn't know? My father likes cheddar, so that's what we have. Maybe I used to like something else. It's like you said, I had that forgetting who you are disorder. I didn't remember what was right and what was wrong when I left Pax, but now I do. Now I know I need to get there. I know that. All right, maybe so, but you're still on one leg, boy. It isn't possible. Look at the distance. Vola sat down with the map. No, I've wasted enough time. I'm not listening anymore. Hold on. Vola lifted the paper. You come over here. See something. Peter frowned, but he swung back over. Robert Johnson, bus driver friend I've been telling you about. Who's been mailing your letters? See this spot here? She tapped the top left corner of the map in the article. That town is the final stop on his route. He passes here at 10 past 11 Tuesdays and Saturdays, and this is where he pulls up at the end of the night. What if I put you on that bus tomorrow? Seems like that would save you at least 250 miles. Leave you about 40 to cover on your own. You listening now? Peter dropped his crutches and sank to the chair, jelly-legged with relief. You do that for me? Only 40 miles? That's nothing. No, 40 miles across woods and hills on crutches is not nothing. 3 days at least, I'd figure, and it'll just about kill you, but I think you can do it. So, you'll stay the night now? Deal? Peter took her hand and met her gaze. Deal. Looking at Vola, her face still tear-streaked from what had happened in the barn, he knew he couldn't leave things as broken as they were, and he didn't have much time to fix them. Deal, he said again, on 3 conditions. All right, chapter 23. The moon shone through the trees as full and creamy yellow as the eggs Pax had eaten a week before. His stomach cramped as he paced the river's edge. Only 3 times in the week and a half since the humans had left him had he eaten a meal big enough to fill his belly. And the last one, a pile of fish rotting on the bank, he'd retched up minutes later. He had retrieved and catched ham and watched with pride as Bristle and Runt ate the meat, but he hadn't touched any of it. And he still had no luck hunting. All his fat reserves were gone. His coat hung loose, and he was burning muscle. Pax trained his nose to the humans' camp, which, as always, tortured him with its rich food scents. Over the past 2 days, more war-sick had arrived, and hundreds of them were massing to the south beyond. The ground vibrated with their threat, but Pax was hungry. He looked over to where Bristle was guarding the sleeping Runt and signaled that he would leave. Although he could see the camp directly above him, he chose his old route, up the gorge and across the ridge, because the guards on the wall were facing the river. He padded up the rocks in the water, leaving no tracks. Away from the silence of the devastated field, his ears pricked towards the night sounds. He knew them now. They comforted him. Then, the thin piping of bats, the careless crashing of waddling skunk, and the underground bustle of voles, the distant calls of owls, all these sounds told him he was not hunting alone. Pax himself made no noise. He had learned the secrets of stealth from Gray and Bristle. Like a shadow, he slipped across the ridge, down the hill, and into the grub tent. No easy meat hung this night, but the tables were piled high with vegetables and breads. He knocked a wheel of cheese to the ground. The taste was strong and strange, but he gulped until his belly stretched tight. As he headed back out carrying a hunk for Bristle, a familiar scent stopped him in his tracks. Peanut butter. It was drifting out of a large metal can. Pax dropped the cheese. He stood to sniff at the rim. Like the garbage bin at his boy's home, the can promised a variety of scraps, but above the calming lead scents rose the one he craved more than any other. His whiskers ruffled in pleasure. He nudged the lid aside a few inches. The clear jar lay on top of the heap, its sides still smeared with the thick creamy prize. Pax edged his snout under the lid and bit the top of the rim carefully. He knew from experience that this was how to grip the jar so it didn't cover his nose. He pushed away the garbage can. And the lid clattered to the stony ground, ringing an alarm in the quiet night. Pax ducked under the table and froze. His pulse quickened. Across the tent, the flap snapped open. A human stepped in and clicked on a beam of light. Even over the peanut butter, Pax recognized the scent. His boy's father. Pax raised a paw, ready to dart in whatever direction seemed safest. The man swept the light around the tent. When it fell on Pax's eyes, he winced, but he didn't move. There's a picture. I think you could see him up there. His pupils adjusted, and Pax saw the man crouch to stare at him. Pax remained frozen, paw still raised, jar still clamped in his jaws, studying the man's face as the man studied his. The man grunted, rubbing his chin, then he gave a rough laugh. Pax lowered his paw an inch, holding the man's gaze, testing him. His boy's father laughed again, then rose and lifted the tent flap. He kicked his boot through the opening. Pax knew the signal. The man had used it on him often at the door of the human's house, at the door of his pen. Go through. It meant, go through right now and I won't harm you. The pact was reliable. Pax sped past him into the safety of the night. He didn't slow down until he reached the spine of the hill. He buried the jar and then crouched to watch for movement at the camp in the pre-dawn light. Although he was certain no humans had followed him, he took off east, snaking a loose loop for half an hour before doubling back to drop down to the river. Runt was awake when Pax returned, and for the first time since the explosion, he was struggling to rise. Bristle urged him back down. But Pax saw that his lips were cracked and his eyes sunken. He needs water. Bristle looked to the river's edge, a dozen full bounds for a healthy fox. Would it even be possible for Runt? The little fox braced his forelegs. He tightened his haunches to rise, then looked back in surprise. The legs had been that had been part of him his whole life, as much a part of him as his own scent, was gone. He bent and sniffed at the wound. He looked up at Pax and then Bristle as if searching for an explanation. Again he strained upward. His one remaining back leg jacked him up, and Runt rolled onto his wounded haunch with a yelp of pain. Pax leaped to stand by his injured side. Runt got to his front legs once more and then straightened his one back leg. Again he canted over. This time, though, he fell against the strong, tall flank of the older fox, and he did not cry out. He wobbled, searching for new balance. When he found it, Pax took a single step towards the water, then waited. Runt stepped out, first the two front legs, then a dragging hop with the single back leg, and a collapse against Pax. Again, Pax took a single step. Again, the small fox matched it, and again, and once more, until he didn't waver at all. Bristle ran ahead to the bank, and step by wounded step, Runt closed the distance until he flopped down by the river bank and stretched his neck out to lap at the cool water. When he was sated, he dropped his head, his eyes closing, but Bristle nipped him. Soon it would be full daylight. He would be exposed. She ran upriver to a stand of cattails. Runt limped after her. He was still clumsy and trembling and slow, but he did not fall once. Pax followed close by. Just as they reached the stand of reeds, Pax startled at the crackling of brush from downstream. Bristle's head snapped around too, ears cocked to the same spot across the river. Something large was coming. Runt dipped his head to sniff at a snail. Pax and Bristle backed into the cattail reeds. Bristle called to her brother. Runt did not turn his head. A buck pranced out of the vegetation, tossed his antlers, then splashed into the river. Bristle barked for her brother again, and again he ignored her. The deer clattered up onto the other bank, heading for the bright grass of the unscorched area of field. At its edge he lifted a hoof. As he set it down, the earth rocked and the bright grass blew. The buck burst up, his back twisting and snapping. Runt screamed his terror at the quaking ground. Bristle and Pax herded him into the cool dark of the reeds and soothed him until he understood that he was unharmed. The foxes watched the soldiers run down the hill, sweep their beams of light over the heap in the field, then go back. As a pink sun rose over the pines, vast patches of grass in the field flared up and crackled. Field mice stumbled out towards the cool safety of the riverbank. Dazed and disoriented, they would have made easy meals, but Bristle let them pass, as if obeying some code that protected those so terrified. She stood and gazed over the smoking field. We have to leave here now. Pax knew that she was right. He followed her out of the reeds. Bristle called to Runt, who was watching Wandering Bull. He didn't even flick his ears towards his sister. As Pax understood, he can't hear. Oh man, poor Runt. We will be back tomorrow with chapters 24 and 25. We're getting there, guys. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.